All right, so thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. My name is Alex Baddick. I am a part of Empowerment Squared. It's an organization, a nonprofit in Hamilton. We work directly with young people and families from newcomer populations. And this session is put on today by the Hamilton Education Law Program. So this program is funded by the Law Foundation of Ontario. And this session today, Understanding Ontario's Education System, is in partnership with the Black Legal Action Center. And with Black is Patricia Suleman, who's with us today to lend her expertise in this topic. So today's just going to be a brief little overview on Ontario's education system. We hope to introduce a couple of issues that we have identified in our professional capacity, but we want to be able to turn it over to the participants this afternoon to engage in a discussion as well about some of the issues that they might identify with the legislation or policies in Ontario's education system. I think one of the goals here is to help people understand and appreciate the tools available to them in identifying these issues and in hopefully taking action and addressing some of those issues that they might identify. So like I said, my name's Alex Baddick. We have Patricia with me, and we have our facilitator, Hargun Graywall, who will be leading the discussion today. I'm going to turn it over to Hargun at this time. And over the next 40 or so minutes, we'll just go back and forth with our presentation just before getting the audience involved. So please, if you're paying attention, make sure you write down your questions, because we're going to give you an opportunity at the end of the discussion to engage as well with not just us, but with the other participants as well. So thank you, and I hope you enjoy this afternoon's session, Understanding Ontario's Education System.
Thanks, Alex, for that great introduction. So yeah, my name's Hargan, and I'll just be facilitating the conversation today surrounding understanding Ontario's education system. So yeah, just to go over a quick agenda of what we'll be discussing. So we're gonna have a quick overview on what Ontario's education system consists of, rethinking Ontario's education system, turning our understanding into action, and then some closing remarks from both Patricia as well as any audience participants in the conversation that would like to join in. So just a few housekeeping matters as well. When you're not speaking, just be sure to keep yourself muted, just so that way there's no noise from both sides. And then there's a chat feature available at the bottom corner. So if you would like to ask any questions or put in any comments, you're more than welcome to do so. There'll be a volunteer monitoring and taking down questions for them to be asked later. And yeah, and then we will try our best to answer all the questions and comments at the end. And then yeah, just be sure not to ask any personal questions or non-subject related questions during the event. There will be a discussion near the end, so we look forward to opening it up to that near the end. But yeah, so moving on towards our part one of the conversation. So it's the overview of Ontario's education system. So Ontario's education system is robust. There are many roles and stakeholders involved, but it is also rich of a lot of history. So the evolution of education in Ontario is marked by the centralization and power. So we wanted to ask some questions in regard to this topic. So we are hoping that Alex and Patricia would have some knowledge and information of. So starting off with the first question, it's how has Ontario's education system evolved over the years?
Right, well, thank you, Hargun, for kicking us off. And I think this whole discussion should really get a kind of big picture view on what Ontario's education system has looked like over the years. And it has a pretty lengthy history. Ontario itself hasn't necessarily been called Ontario for the duration of the education system within this geographic area. Canada was still forming many, many years ago. And in 1807, we actually didn't see Ontario as it is today, but we did see the development of the first publicly funded schools at this time. What we begin to see over the years is that local schools were developed with school board trustees being able to kind of mold the education system in that area to fit the needs of that community. As the years developed, we saw a centralization, like Harlan mentioned, of the roles and responsibilities of the school system move up to the government and away from the local municipalities and local systems in those boards. So, for example, in 1816, local school board trustees were able to decide on hiring criteria for schools that they served. But this power was uploaded to the province, or what was close to being the province at the time, in 1824. But there are many different trends that we are able to see over the years. We also noticed that in 1850, we see a segregation of the school system. We'll talk about it a little bit more in terms of what the division of education looks like in Ontario. But in 1850, we saw the segregation of schools into religion. We had a publicly funded Catholic school system. But we also saw racially segregated schools being developed this time. Now, the rationale around this period was that these divisions would create communities more tailored to meet those specific needs. So Catholic schools would support Catholic students and families. And the idea was that racially segregated schools may be able to cater to those groups as well. But that was quickly used in a very negative way, in racist ways. School board trustees were able to use that power to segregate populations in Ontario. Specifically in Southwest Ontario, we saw Black populations being excluded from publicly funded schools and directed to those segregated schools. But as the years persisted, we again see that the appointment of a Minister of Education was created. We saw different powers move from trustees to the provincial government. And we also saw some of the evolution of society and social values in that racially segregated schools began to be closed. Indian residential schools also were closed as well. So this is all to say, Ontario's education system is very rich and robust in history. It's not what it looks like today as it did almost 200 years ago, over 200 years ago. And also, we have to keep in mind that the system is constantly evolving. And what that means is it's reacting to a lot of social cues in society. Only recently we saw some more, pretty recently, as in yesterday, I think there were some laws that came into effect, or a bill was passed for new laws in the education system. And we are able to see this trend every few years of significant change in the education system. So these are just different markers to consider. And we want to really talk about today how these different markers kind of indicate some of the issues that we're seeing today in our education system. So I think Patricia is going to just explain to us now, how are Ontario's education systems actually governed?
Thank you so much, Alex, and thank you, Hargan. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Patricia Suleman, and I'm one of the staff lawyers at the Black Legal Action Center. So today, for basis of our conversation, it really is just legal information and not advice. Of course, if anyone requires advice, you're more than welcome to call us. You can call my office specifically where I work if you do identify as Black. And of course, I'm sure Alex is able to answer any questions later on as well. So just in a broad overview of Ontario's education system, specifically in our province, it falls entirely under the jurisdiction of our provincial government. So we have a Minister of Education, we have a Ministry of Education, and right now that is part of the provincial conservative government that we have, who currently has a majority sit-in. So just to be clear, since this is the Hamilton Education Law Program, I just want to give an example of Ohsweken, Ontario. Schools on the Six Nations Reserve of Grand River, those schools fall under the federal jurisdiction, under the federal government. So specifically, Indigenous peoples in Canada with Indian status can attend those schools, and those schools are federally funded. Hargan, I thank you so much. I think you're on mute. My apologies.
Sorry, yeah.
No problem.
I was trying to think, but thank you so much for that. I was also wondering, do you think you would be able to explain to us how education is provided in Ontario?
Absolutely. So in Ontario, like I mentioned, it is under the Education Act, so that is provincial. The purpose of education is to provide students with an opportunity to really realize their full potential and develop high skill, knowledgeable, caring citizens who contribute to their society. And just to take a step back at that slide that we just passed, I want to give a brief example of how laws change very fast on what Alex was saying. We did see that bill that was recently passed, specifically in Schedule 5. So there are changes now where people who want to be directors of boards of education don't have to have an education background in teaching. So that is very big. We'll discuss that later when we talk about EDI, or equity, development, equity, diversity, and inclusion. But that is very important in terms of human resource policies and policies to have accountability, to have members of society actually being represented. So like I mentioned, we do have a conservative government here in the province of Ontario. I'm sure people on the call are aware that things and laws change so fast in the government that we're in. When we see bills that are passed, whether it's on the first reading or when they get royal assent, it's fast. So this was just the other day. So it's just to keep a heads up on what's been happening here in Ontario.
That sounds very informative. I was also wondering, do you think you would be able to expand upon how roles in Ontario's education system are structured?
So in Ontario, we have, you mind just going one more slide, Argan? Thank you so much. In Ontario here, we have public and private schools. We also have schools that are for primary, secondary, and post-secondary institutions. But I want to be clear on, just give a really brief example on the different types of schools that we have here that are publicly funded. So we have 4 types of school boards in the province. Under Section 93 of the Constitution, Roman Catholics have the right to a publicly funded, separate denominational school system. And French-speaking families here have the right to attend French language schools. So depending on their language, religion, or background or choice, students can attend English public, English Catholic, French public, and French Catholic schools here in the province. Those are all publicly funded, just so people understand on the call today. And specifically, when we move forward on our conversation, Alex and I and Hargan will focus on the English Public School Board. So when we hear and talk about school boards and changes, or even issues that we're seeing in our line of work, we'll be focusing on the public board for today. And when we turn to funding here in the province, of course, schools are funded by tax dollars, and there's a pure pupil funding. So this can be very different. It's not meant to be equal, and we'll discuss equity issues that we see, but it's based on enrollment. It can be based on funding specifically for teachers, for educational assistants, any learning materials that schools may need, or technology. There's also funding for repair and maintenance, and there is a specific funding formula for that. So we have, for the elementary school system, we have 100 square feet per elementary student. That's the funding formula. The funding formula for secondary students are 130 square feet per secondary student. And for adult education, it's 100 square feet per adult education student. So that's just the simple formula for maintenance and like repair of buildings. When we have school boards actually receiving funding and how they distribute it to schools, that is not equal, and it can change totally on many, many factors, such as special education, any needs for French language support or English language support, transportation, and the list continues. But like I mentioned, it's not equal. It's not meant to be equal. It's meant to address different needs in different schools and school boards. But what we do see is we're not seeing an equal opportunity for students. We're seeing different factors and different educational opportunities based on where people live. And I'm sure Alex will discuss that later. So that is an issue that we do see. So school boards, overall, they make the decisions about individual school budgets, and then that specific school will receive that budget from the board.
Right. And if I could just add to that. So yeah, the province does fund these public school boards. And just bringing it back, we see that there are 4 publicly funded school boards. So taxpayers kind of opt into one of these. If your child goes to an English Catholic school board, that's the school board that you're paying into. That's where your tax dollars will go to. Most people typically pay into the English public school boards. And again, that's what Patricia mentioned. We'll be focusing on the English public today. So many of the issues that we're identifying might be specifically related to that board, although they're very likely to apply to other school boards as well. All right. So in talking about the school board, we're looking at it from a very high level. We understand it's governed by the Education Act. We understand that the province has jurisdiction over the school boards in Ontario, but there are so many different roles in actually running the system. And many people may not be fully aware of all the different roles at the many different levels in Ontario's education system. So just a very brief overview about some of the larger roles in the system we'll run through right now, starting with the Ministry of Education. So the Ministry of Education is led by the Minister of Education, who is today the Honorable Stephen Lecce, who essentially makes decisions about the education system in this province. And with the assistance of his office, they're able to administer provincial statutes and regulations concerning education, including those that set the length of the school year, allocating funds to the school boards in a fair manner using the education funding model that Patricia describes. In addition to that, they also develop curriculum and requirement for student diplomas. So if we're looking at it from a hierarchy, with everything revolving around the success of a student, the Ministry of Education is on top. Beneath the Ministry of Education are the local school boards, and there are many school boards throughout Ontario. I don't have a number, but it is quite a lot. And the school boards across Ontario operate from this provincially funded model, and the boards administer the funding they receive from the province to their local schools. At the school board level, they determine the size and the location of schools that are being made. They provide educational programs that actually meet the needs of the school community. Now, historically speaking, and I mentioned previously, school board trustees have operated at a very local level to deliver education to the unique needs of that community. And historically, if we look back at some of the different programming that school boards have developed through social innovation, we'll notice that a lot of the programs that are now offered all across the province actually started from local school boards. My understanding is that, for example, adult education started at a local school board level. It was later adopted by the province, and now you will have adult education programs throughout Ontario. So it's a very innovative way of being able to keep the education system updated. And it also provides a lot of opportunities for us as community members to be able to try to get some change in our communities, the kind of change that might support the specific needs of our communities. So just below the school boards are the administrative kind of arms of the school system. So the school boards that students attend, the schools. So the Director of Education leads the day-to-day functions of the school board. And the director is assisted by associate directors who each have a specific portfolio within that school board to carry out. Now, underneath the associate directors and the Director of Education are superintendents of education, and they are assigned to specific schools within the school board. And if we're still looking at the hierarchy, underneath the superintendents are the principals and vice principals who actually manage the schools on a day-to-day basis. And they administer school budgets, maintain student records, so on and so forth. And then you have teachers and staff, and we know teachers, they prepare lesson plans, teach classes, and evaluate student work and progress. You have other staff that are there to support teachers and students in a variety of ways, including custodians and teaching assistants and other specialists in their field that work with students and support the school on a day-to-day basis. But in talking about the school system, we know that there are embedded roles within that structure, but there are also stakeholders in Ontario's education system that might work outside of that system directly. And what I mean by that is that there are stakeholders that don't necessarily aren't necessarily employed by the school boards or the Ministry of Education, but are working alongside to support our education system. And I think most obviously is the Ontario College of Teachers, who are the Ontario College of Teachers are the ones who are qualified teachers that are able to teach in English public schools. They do a lot of work with the government through, I think, bargaining. Someone might have to correct me on that. The unions, of course, are also present in that. I don't think I've included them here. But EQAO is also significant. And they are the ones who administer those tests on a yearly basis for several different grades. We have student trustees, parent involvement committees, school councils, student councils. Now, the significance of these roles are in how they shape education as well. Certainly, the system is run by the Ministry of Education, and at each level that I just mentioned, they each shape how schools look. But these different stakeholders also play a vital role in how education is shaped across the province. And when we think of school councils, we think of parents and the suggestions that they're able to make. We think of student trustees who give the student input. And then we think of teachers who also have their unions and shape what education looks like in Ontario on a day-to-day basis as well.
Thank you so much for that overview and breakdown of Ontario's education system, Patricia and Alex. So now as we move on to like the second part, it will be regarding rethinking Ontario's education system. So now with the high level understanding of how education looks like within the province, there may be some easily identifiable issues with the way in which policies and laws are used to govern our schools. So now we would like everyone to start thinking about what are some legislative shortcomings in education system in the education system, and what are some improvements to be made. So yeah, we would like to give everyone, all the participants within the conversation, an opportunity in the next few minutes to let us know what are your thoughts and sort of create a broader discussion than the issues presented here. That could be done within the chat or yeah, as well.
Okay, so so thank you for that, Hargan. So I think what we're gonna, what Patricia and I are gonna do over the next few minutes is actually share some of our professional insights into some of the perhaps legislative or policy shortfalls in Ontario's education system, how this might manifest on a day-to-day basis and affect students and families. What I hope you guys are able to do as well is contribute some of your thoughts as well of how legislative or policy failures or shortcomings might contribute to other inequities that you can hopefully highlight at the end of this. So there's several things we're going to touch on: the funding formula, the children's rights, equity, diversity, inclusion, and online learning. So we mentioned the funding formula, and Patricia explained that very well. I kind of broke it down a little bit. Now, one of the key issues that I'd like to identify with the funding formula is that it doesn't necessarily address issues of inequity throughout our society. And what I mean by that is every school is allotted funding based on the same formula. So it's a funding that's based per head. Now, what we don't distinguish in policy or education really is, or the legislation, is the differences between school communities. Some schools have higher socioeconomic families in that neighborhood. Other schools have lower socioeconomic families in that neighborhood. What this means is that the funding that's available to those schools they're going to be the same. You have the same amount of students in each school, but these schools have very different characteristics. This can affect for example, social work support that's available to some schools. Schools that might have a higher need for social workers may make it a lot more difficult for those students to access those same social work supports if they don't have additional funding. Some schools are also able to get more donations than other schools. Many schools from higher socioeconomic areas may have the ability to receive higher donations than other schools, which as well makes it a little bit more inequitable in that some schools receive more money for more programs, more resources, so on and so forth. School educational consultants are also something that is very necessary for many communities, but because of the way the funding is structured, some schools may have a more difficult time accessing those for the high needs in their neighborhoods versus other schools that may not actually need those things as much. So I think what this also touches on is the rights of the child. We have students in education, and in our province, we have a very child-centered perspective. The United Nations Convention of the Rights of the Child is an international obligation that Canada has and Ontario must follow. What this means is that we must be very specific about how we address a lot of the needs of students. And sometimes the needs of students aren't necessarily met because the children's rights in Ontario aren't always centered in our policy or our legislations. For example, when it comes to things such as student discipline, a student actually does not have their right to appeal in many instances. The law is very specific about who is able to appeal a decision for suspension or expulsion. And if we look at Section 309, subsection 1 of the Education Act, we see that this appeal right is only granted to parents or guardians and students in some circumstances. There's a paper by an academic who does education law that speaks specifically about this kind of contradiction in our understanding of this child-centered approach in Ontario, with this discrepancy in the child's voice being able to be heard in some of these circumstances. So that's an issue that's identified. But also, all children have a right to safety in schools, but what does safety look like? How does that feel? How does safety manifest in students' experiences? And we have definitely developed a greater understanding of that as a society over the years. But when we think about issues like most recently, probably not recently, but in 2018, the To Kill a Mockingbird issue about Black students specifically, who sit in classes and might have to hear the N-word that pops up frequently from this book. The voice of the child, if the child says they're uncomfortable with that, how does that play or factor into the way that curriculum is developed? And this is a broader issue than just one book. It's an issue about representation in school. If children are telling us that they want to be able to see themselves more, should the legislation or policies that we have in place reflect these things? So in thinking about children's rights and this child-centered approach to education in Ontario, I think it's very important that our legislation reflects some of these things, and perhaps not necessarily that I think so, but if our understanding of Ontario's education system is one that should be aligned with the United Nations Convention of the Rights, some of these different issues and policies and legislation surely may need to be addressed if we are to be in line with some of the stipulations in this. And I'm very interested in learning the participants' thoughts about this, but even more broader about some of the issues that I just touched on, children's rights and how that relates to legislation and policy in Ontario's education system.
Thank you, Alex. And yeah, like we see that there's a lot of like comments in the group chat, so please keep on putting them in. So now moving on the conversation, how do we rethink the equity, diversity, and inclusion within schools as well as like the entire education system?
So really for EDI, or equity, diversity, inclusion, I'll start saying EDI just to be short. We need to have accountability measures here in the province. And when I say accountability, I mean actually changes that are meaningful and actually can be substantive when we have students in a classroom or we have teachers in a classroom that actually reflect the community or reflect the board that they serve. So it needs to be really, when we look at what diversity means or what inclusivity or equity means, we need to be representative of Ontario. We need to be representative of our school board, and that's at all levels. So that's from teachers, principals, superintendents, up to the board of directors. So at a governance level, administrative, we need to have a community that's serving, that actually looks like people in the room. And so it's important when we talk about EDI, we can click those check marks, whether it's, you know, women or racialized or speaks another language, and we could still have a room with 0 Black people. So I just want to use that example. And I use the example of individuals who identify as Black because I represent the Black Legal Action Center. We get a lot of calls from teachers and principals where they don't feel heard. They have their own issues in the context of their employment law at education and the anti-Black racism that they face. So when we look at those perspectives, it needs to be meaningful. We've had different governments over 10 years ago with our Liberal government write reports on the importance of EDI, the importance of having students feel welcomed and be in an environment that's open and warm and welcoming so they can actually thrive and fulfill those meanings of what the purpose of the Education Act is. But when we don't have EDI and we don't have meaningful EDI, people don't learn. People are uncomfortable, and it's just not a warm environment for all. Recently, in Ontario, we do have a historic moment that I would like to highlight under the board of directors for 3 main school boards. And we have 3 Black women leading school boards in Toronto, Peel, and Ottawa. But I would like to give an example, a real life example of where EDI has failed, specifically with the review of the Peel District School Board. So this mainly is for hiring practices. So again, this is from a human resources perspective in employment law, where there has been a failure to hire, to promote, and to retain Black educators. And that's a problem because I'm sure people are aware here on the call today, Peel is incredibly diverse, very diverse in the community that they serve, yet the employees and the people at governance levels and administrative levels do not reflect the community. So we have seen a change with the board of director. We're hoping it can be great and meaningful, but it's important to see that when we don't have a welcoming environment, we can't retain good people, and we can't retain people that are coming from an inclusive background. So I think that's something to take in consideration too, and how we rethink that. So we don't want just the numbers that are there. We want people to stay, we want people to grow, and we want people to get promotions in it.
I think that is great, Patricia. Thank you for that insight. Now moving the conversation on to like sort of our current circumstances, how might online learning in a post-COVID world require us to think the current laws and policies that are present right now?
Yeah, so even when we revisit that kind of timeline that I initially brought up of what education in Ontario has looked like, there are so many different milestones throughout Ontario's education system where laws have changed. And it's very distinct moments in history that you can see there was a societal shift in some way. Whether or not it was maybe, I can't remember, in the 2000s when suspension, the Safe Schools Act was kind of revisited, and this zero tolerance approach to discipline in schools was changed because of the Human Rights Commission. That changed the Education Act profoundly for students. You have moments throughout history in Ontario where the Education Act had to be kind of profoundly changed in similar ways. Given that COVID-19 has created this new need for distance learning, and given the fact that we have entered the 21st century, there's a higher reliance on technology, I think it's an interesting question to pose to everyone in Ontario. What does online learning look like for education in Ontario? And does the legislation we have and the policies that are in place sufficiently or adequately address some of these issues? It's a very legitimate issue when we, again, revisit equity in our education system. When we look at students from diverse socioeconomic backgrounds, we might be able to look at different levels of support that are available at home for students who are given work and expected to complete that at home. The parental support that's available isn't necessarily there for every student. So how will that play a role in the ability for students to succeed? What about the resources that are in place that are going to allow some students to be more successful on an academic level than others? So not every child in Ontario has the same environment in which they are able to. Not every child in Ontario has an environment conducive to successful learning. We must be able to differentiate between these different students and these different students' needs. So online learning poses a very difficult challenge in that sense, but it opens up so many different cans of worms when it comes to equity for students. But what about teachers? How are they able to deliver their lesson plans sufficiently in this kind of environment? The synchronous learning that is expected of teachers right now, is that something that is a wise policy? What is the best practice for these things? We don't really know, and I don't even know if the legislation adequately addresses that. I don't know if we can point to anything in the legislation that sufficiently gives any guidance to any of these practices that will be necessary potentially in the future. So these are some questions that we need to really revisit and really start thinking about. So in ending off on that, I again want you all to hopefully come up with some thoughts about any other issues that you might be able to identify with policy or legislation, or maybe you want to add on to some of the issues that we very briefly discussed in our general discussion right now. But we'll continue the conversation for a few more minutes before getting you involved.
Thank you, Alex. So now moving into like our sort of the final discussion portion of like the webinar. So turning understanding of these of the education system and its sort of shortcomings into action. So if we can identify these issues, then we also need to be able to identify the solutions and take actions toward them. So Patricia and Alex, if you have any insight onto that, that would be great.
So I would just add that your voice really matters, whether you're a parent or a guardian. If you're even voting, if you're at voting age, it's really important to vote and pay attention because there's a lot at stake in our education system here in Ontario. So earlier I used the example of Peel and issues that are seen in Peel. At Black, we do have a provincial mandate, so we serve the whole province. So we get calls from Hamilton, London, Kawartha, and the issues are all the same when it comes to systemic anti-Black racism. So my suggestion always is try to vote, do your best on the provincial elections, vote at the municipal elections. You want to know who's your school board trustee. You want to know who you can turn to. Lately in the news, we have seen comments and incredibly racist comments made by people that are pretty high up in the education system, but how did they get there? So when it comes to accountability, it really is full circle. It starts with us as well. I'm not a parent, but I make sure I vote every single time and I look into who the local people are in terms of my trustee. So I know what their political stance is, if it's something I agree with, whether or not they believe in EDI and accountability in terms of individuals who come from a racialized background. I find that's also very important. But really, every single vote counts. I know people only really focus sometimes on federal elections, but education here is provincial at the public level. So please do your best and vote if you can.
Right. So just to add on to that, the people that you have elected, specifically the local school board trustees, their roles are incredibly significant. And I point again to the fact that historically speaking, these roles have been it's been a very useful catalyst for change in communities. They are incredibly useful in that they are socially innovative tools that can be used to change issues in our local communities. So going back to adult education that may have been used as initially to solve an issue within some community across Ontario. That was at a school board level that was developed. So the ability to influence change should not be forgotten at a school board level. It's actually one of the most significant, in my opinion, political roles that you you do end up voting for at your municipal and provincial elections. So we can't underestimate that at all. But parent council and other student-led groups or community advocacy groups, there's so much power in mobilizing around an issue. We've seen this all across the province in the past few months, from different school boards from east to west. We've seen the mobilization of parents for issues from streaming to anti-Black racism, things that are incredibly relevant to students on a day-to-day basis. The power in being able to put pressure on individual representatives should not be forgotten. And we know this because it keeps popping up in the media all the time. In Hamilton, to keep things local, they were just able to overturn the student resource officer or police student resource officers in the school board. And that took an incredibly large effort on behalf of students as well as other community members to mobilize and consistently attend meetings and other events to make sure that their voices were heard. We see the same in Peel, but we also see teachers doing the same for issues that affect the quality of education in Ontario. And the pressure that these different groups are putting on cannot go unnoted, because I think they have led to very tangible changes in our community today.
Right now, of course, we are in COVID-19 and we're really in uncertain times. So I just want to put on, just give you the example that just stay on top of things. If you're unclear, you can call us. There are many local community organizations like Alex just mentioned, but there's a potential for a lot of change. And in the government we're in, it happens very fast. So your voice is important. It's also important to know where to go if you do have a complaints process. It's very different in all jurisdictions in different school boards. So we can definitely help you with that if you do have that in the future. But I would just suggest that we don't even know what the school system will look like in September. We don't know whether or not kids will go back full time, whether or not they'll remain online, whether or not they'll be part-time, as we're still in the emergency order here in Ontario. So really just pay attention. Things happen fast. We get the provincial updates every few days here on the news. So I would just suggest that because we are in uncertain times, it's really important for us to mobilize and stick together to understand what changes are happening and how we can be unified as a community to address those changes. My concern that some of the calls that I've been getting, when Alex mentioned online learning, there are definitely some students that have learning disabilities that are kind of being left behind right now and not getting help that they didn't have in May and in June of this year. So I am looking forward to hopefully a system that we can help to make it robust, to actually address issues so all kids can get the help that they need.
I think that was a really great way to empower people in order to make sure that they know which resources to turn to. So that was very great. So now opening it up to the audience, this is our question period for everyone to share their thoughts or any comments. So yeah, if there were any other elements in regards to Ontario's education system that we should expand upon further, or that you would like to speak on, then we would welcome you to do so. Or even just considering any other elements of law and policy that we need to rethink, you're more than welcome to contribute to that as well. So yeah, you'll have about 2 minutes to share your thoughts. And if you would like to, just raise your hand and then the host will let you speak.
Thank you. And we have Shelly who raised her hand. So Shelly, go ahead. You should be able to unmute. So whenever you're ready.
Hi, thank you, everyone. Thanks for the great presentation. I didn't know that background history of the education system, so I found it really helpful. Just a question, I'll try to keep it brief. When we talk about community mobilization, so I live in Peel, so I've been keeping up to date and sometimes participating in some of the action that was happening in Peel. And I just wanted to know, with respect to this Bill 195, that the Conservative government just rammed through, is there any way that community mobilization would have stopped that? Or is that just something that the government, I mean, we know they have the power to do whatever it is they want, but from your perspective, is there something more that we needed to do? Like, I know I signed a petition. I know there was a petition going around. but and ultimately this still happened. Is there something that we needed to have done?
So just in terms of what you're saying, Shelley, thank you so much for your question. A lot of times it's really good if we can try to make statements or deputations on bills. I know it can be incredibly difficult because it just happens so fast. I know at our office at Black, we have written some submissions on different bills that this government has passed. We wrote on it. We even went to Queen's Park pre-COVID and made actual in-person deputations, and the bill still got passed. But I think it's still important as a community that we show how this affects us and why we don't want this bill. So I think it's always good to unify. It's great that you're doing that out of Peel. I know there's Parents of Black Children up in New York region. I know there's Pathways to Education that work directly with students. So there's ways that we can keep each other aware of things that are happening. So it's great that you signed a statement. It's great that you're aware of that. But I think the best thing we can continue doing is at least to get the statements out there, show why this affects us and why we don't want it to pass.
Okay, thank you.
And if I could add to that, your local school board trustees are supposed to be your advocates at Queen's Park as well. They're supposed to be the ones speaking up on behalf of the entire school board. So it goes back to really being able to elect quality school board trustees, ones that will see that these things are in the pipeline and in development on behalf of the government, and saying, wait, hold on behalf of our entire population in this region, we're not for that. And I completely agree that there is significance to petitions from groups and stuff like that. But I do think there is so much value in having your local school board trustees speaking on behalf of the entire school board, and the statements that that board can make on behalf of those school boards should be very significant to the government. So it's unfortunate that some of these things weren't heard at the government level, but it's the pressure that we have to keep on them, because these laws, just as easily as it was changed, the government in power right now has the power to just as easily make some new laws in the future. They have the power right now to do so. So the pressure just needs to stay on. Hopefully we can get the kind of education system we're looking for over the years to come.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we have Amit that will be next. There you go. Can you speak? Is there?
Oh, I think you're on mute, Amit.
Can we unmute him? Maybe I need to unmute him.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Oh, perfect. Hello.
Perfect.
Yes.
Hi. So yeah, thanks for the presentation. I really like the idea of rethinking. I mean, I've been an educator in Peel for almost 20 years. I'm currently a vice principal in Peel, and there's a lot of work that we need to do. And that was part of my comment that I put in the chat there, was the idea of accountability. And right now, this government does have the power to make a lot of changes, and I really wish they would make some changes to the College of Teachers, because the College of Teachers ultimately governs the appraisal process for teachers, the appraisal process for administrators, and right now, you know, the EDI that you were speaking to earlier, Patricia, it's not really something that we can actually evaluate. Like, you just say, okay, have you attended a workshop here and there? And that's about it. But we really need to get into the heart of, you know, anti-oppressive, you know, work, anti-oppression work, you know, anti-Black racism. It needs to be explicitly named, so that as a vice principal, I can ask teachers, what are you doing to promote anti-Black racism in your classroom? And then I can also be asked the same question by my superintendent. And I think that right now is a great time for that change to be happening. I don't know who we need to press to, you know, make that happen, but I really think that it's something that needs to change. And until that changes, I think you'll just see teachers will continue to close their classroom doors and do what they want to do. And you'll see administrators who will, you know, quietly just kind of let things happen. But for any parents who are listening, again, push your administrators at the schools to make these changes happen, because it is on us to make sure that the teachers are doing the right thing in their classroom. So.
Thank you so much for that.
No problem.
I had a question for one of our participants about kind of this child rights perspective in Ontario's education system, and how much of that do we appreciate in our legislation and policies currently. So JF, Jean-Frederic, is a part of the chat as well. I'm just going to throw it over to him to hopefully talk a little bit more about that, if you don't mind.
There we go. Bam. All right, cool. Hi, I'm so sorry I came in late, by the way. I feel really bad. Anyway, time got away from me. Yeah, so on the child rights front, thanks for mentioning that. I love that that was part of this. In case you're wondering who I am, my name is JF. I, up until recently, was counsel at the Office of the Ontario Ombudsman. I'm now starting my PhD in education law, in law, but focusing on child rights and education law at the University of Ottawa. So just to contextualize where I'm coming from. Alex and I connected over the years. He wrote an article for TVO and the Hamilton Legal Clinic about suspensions and expulsions. And then from there, I was like, hey, this guy's cool. So that's where I'm from. Anyway, sorry. So on the child rights front, what's really interesting, so the Education Act has no explicit mention of child rights in any way, shape, or form. It's really interesting in that sense. But there is actually legislation in Ontario that does. And I think it's a really good example of what can be done when communities sort of get together and are able to sort of take advantage of the zeitgeist, if you will. So what's neat about the Child, Youth, and Family Services Act, which governs the extremely problematic child protection or child welfare system, for the first time, not for the first time, but for the first time sort of explicitly makes child rights part of the entire framework. And that's only since 2017. So that is really, really recent, but it is a good example that I think is worth looking back to for those who want to organize as to how that happened. Because it was really, it was led by youth voices in a lot of cases through the former Office of the Provincial Advocate for Children and Youth. That function has now sort of disappeared. The advocacy side of it anyway, investigations are still happening, but there's no advocacy. But with that and with lots of youth voices, so I unfortunately don't have a lot of history on how that happened, but if you look back at the legislative record, it's there. And this explicitly includes rights for children in care, specifically in care. So only if you're in the care of the state. It's a really interesting example. And we know that children in the care of the state are disproportionately racialized or disproportionately Black or disproportionately Indigenous. And so that's something that is just starting now in terms of integrating child rights into child welfare. So I would say it's an opportune moment perhaps also on the education front because child rights speak to equity. Child rights speak to disability and making sure children have access to education and things like that. So sorry, I'll get off my pedestal right now, but I just wanted to say that there are some examples out there of successful legislative change. It took a long time, it took a lot of work, but it's only in the last few years, so it's a pretty recent example. So if you're going legislative route, have a look at the CYFSA 2017.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for that. And I think it's a great point to make, especially since there's already legislation that speaks to the child's rights in Ontario. How do we have something similar incorporated into the Education Act? And for people who are familiar with the Education Act, it's almost like a big quilt that has things being thrown into it often. So it's pretty messy to begin with. I don't think it would be out of character to just piecemeal something else in. Child's rights sounds like a good addition in my opinion. But I actually wanted to get another person who works directly with young people and sees the law and how it affects them. Emily Chan from Justice for Children and Youth is someone that's going to pop on right now and just share a little bit more about student discipline and how some of these issues can harm students or children from the younger years. Emily, I'm going to toss it to you, unmute you, and you can throw your video on. I'm sure you're able to do that. Let me know if you need any help with that.
Okay, great. If everyone can hear me, that'd be fantastic. Alex and I connected a while back when he was articling with our office, which was great. So with discipline, what I want to say is I've been in practice for almost 20 years now, and our client base is not representative of the general population. It's overrepresentative of people living in poverty as well as people of color. I've had the privilege to go speak to students at discipline programs, so the expelled students program, suspended students program, and the audience is not reflective of the general population. it is absolutely people of color in the room, predominantly black and brown students. And this is a jarring difference from when I attend other classrooms with regular students, regular classes, like a civics class or something. And so I think that in the discipline context, it's really important that race is raised. And I think we've been doing it for so many years, but it's been ignored. It is so hard because everyone wants proof. And getting that proof is difficult, as we know, when it's systemic. So we've had some real challenges around that. And what we also see is this begins early. So I'm really grateful that they've said that they're no longer going to suspend the younger students, because that is actually some of the harm. They develop a history of suspensions, and it looks bad on their record. By the time they hit grade 5, they've already been tagged and marked, and the stigma is attached, and they already see themselves as a bad student. From my own experiences and from the experience of all our clients, one bad experience as a younger student, a younger person, will affect your development in a social way, in an emotional way, forever. Like it scars you. And so starting at such an early age where students are kind of flagged for what they say is bad behavior is quite significant. And the other thing that was raised already is that, the rights of the child is not in the Education Act, but the missing voice is so important. We've been lucky that when we do represent the students before disciplinary proceedings and for special education, the school boards have let us do it. But the Education Act alone says, no, it has to be the parent. So that's an important consideration as well, is if you are, helping parents, make sure that you're helping the student also, because it's the student who's going to have to sit there and listen to what is being said about them. And that can be really difficult for the students themselves. I hope that helps address some of the things that Alex and I spoke about. Oh, you're on mute.
That's definitely, I always forget to do that. Thank you so much, Emily. I think that's very helpful, and it clarifies a lot about suspensions. And for those who aren't aware, the government recently just put a prohibition on suspensions from, I believe, kindergarten to grade 3, which is a great step. Perhaps, does anyone want to speak about if that needs to be applied to students all across the board up until grade 12? I don't know if you have any opinion on that, Emily.
I think I do have an opinion. I think at the younger years, I think grade 3 is a bit low still. I think they should have extended it much further than that. And I think they need to ban expulsions at a minimum until high school. I think that's really important in terms of, if you're going to discipline a young person for their behavior, you need to also be able to help them address that behavior. So a suspension and expulsion doesn't necessarily take you in the right direction. So I do think that it's a first step. I don't think it's necessarily enough. I think if you're going to discipline a young person, there has to be other things within the school system to help protect and promote that student. I don't know about getting rid of all suspensions and expulsions entirely. That I'd have to give some more thought to, as well as look at some of the research that maybe JF is going to be pursuing in the fall, which will be great. But I definitely think at the younger years, it's so important that this doesn't happen.
I would agree with that if I can just say something. Our clients at Black definitely are facing suspension and expulsions. And I notice with our older clients that have legal issues, some of them will actually say, I had no problems until I was expelled from school. And then they have a list of legal ongoing issues well into their 40s and 50s. So I think it's very important when we see issues of anti-Black racism in education, specifically for our clients. If we get clients that come in with a suspension, we'll ask right away to the principal or the vice principal, especially if there's a fight, I will ask what happened to their Caucasian counterpart. So that white student who may have been in a fight with the Black student, are they also getting that disparate treatment of facing a suspension? And oftentimes when we make those calls, they're not. oftentimes their parents haven't even been contacted yet. And then for our clients who identify as Black, when their parents come to the school and try to figure out what's going on and even advocate for their children, they're hit with a no trespass order. So we have students that get the suspension and then their parents can't even attend the school to discuss what the legal issue is. So I think that's something to consider. So I would agree with Emily on her point with that. It's definitely, there's more people of color that are facing these issues. And then even going back to what Amit had mentioned in terms of EDI, something we also see with members of our community are issues for employment coming right out of Teachers College. So we are seeing a lot of individuals who identify as Black on the long-term occasional list. They're not given full-time permanent positions. They're just given supply. So they're not really protected in terms of having that full-time gainful employment. So we see a lot of employment law issues as well. So I would just add to that. It really affects our community in many different avenues.
Perfect. Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone, for participating today. I think it was a very great conversation to be able to speak to the participants and learn a little bit more about your perspectives. I am not necessarily seeing any new questions right now. If anyone has any questions, you can raise your hand. Otherwise,
oh, Alex, I think there's a question from Arife in the chat.
Okay, go ahead, read it. I don't know if I see
So the
it.
question is, do you think schools should have information about students' rights and how to access resources available to them posted? And then in brackets, it has kind of like how restaurants must post information about employment standards or accessible. So
Well,
going on that, that's a great question, Arife. Are you on the line?
JF might want to take a stab at answering it, so I'm going to allow. Please go ahead, JF. And Arifa, if you want to be able to chime in as well, please.
We'd love to hear from you too.
Yeah. You start and then I'll talk.
All right, Arifa.
Can you hear me at all?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, it wouldn't let me unmute.
Oh, we just lost you.
Unmute.
Oh, there you go. Yeah,
sorry,
we
I have
can hear you.
my space button. No, it was just more of like, so students, especially high school students, have access to see what their rights are, especially students who, you know, sometimes they're home alone, their parents don't actually know what's going on all the time. For them to be able to partially advocate for themselves, would it be a great idea to be able to have this information posted around high schools and middle schools so that they can access resources and support and then represent that to their parents or kind of advocate for themselves if they need to? So I was just wondering if that was something that would be accessible to the students, if that would make sense to put it in the school.
Yeah, so it's JF here. I hope my internet connection is working because it's being silly. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Yeah. So I agree wholeheartedly. There's no reason why this information shouldn't be readily available. Again, I like to go back to my example of child welfare. There's already an obligation on the province and on service providers to provide children in care information about their rights, information about how to make complaints, information about who to talk to about things. It makes zero sense that the education system wouldn't have that same obligation. Kids are, I shouldn't say kids because I mean, it's a huge age range, but you know, children and youth should all have access to the same information about their rights. And I understand why they're there for children in care, because children in care are particularly vulnerable, but children in schools are also children in the care of the state for the time they're in that school. So 100%, I agree with you on that. I like to think like there are resources out there, like for just for children and youth, for example, I go back to Emily, you know, has some great resources on their website, but that's you going to get those resources probably if you're facing a suspension, expulsion, that should be way earlier than that. And I think this information should be posted in elementary schools and secondary schools. All children should have information about their rights that's available to them in a way that they will understand it. So again, I'll get off my soapbox, but I think that's a great point.
I would agree. I think that's an excellent point, an excellent question. I think if places are publicly funded by tax dollars, it needs to be very clear on a complaints policy. So most offices that are, you know, either nonprofit or funded by tax dollars, right on a website, there's a how to make a complaint. That should definitely be done here because different school boards, it's not transparent. Some school boards don't have a human rights commissioner's office, some do. Some you have to go to specific superintendent. It's just not clear. And I think for us, it seems like most of us speak English, but I represent the Somali community. Members of my community in certain cities in the province don't speak English. So when they are trying to advocate for their children and there's a language barrier on top of not even knowing where to go, it's incredibly difficult. It's incredibly difficult. So that's a great point, Arife. And thank you, JF.
And sorry, just one point that JF made was that there are legislative obligations for many things that haven't been followed to some degree. I think in a lot of instances, there are policies and procedures and laws that are remedies for a lot of the issues that are already available. Now, the issue to me in a lot of instances becomes accountability. Who is holding these individuals or institutions accountable? So I think that's where pressure on your trustees, on government officials to give more teeth to some of the ability to hold people accountable is important. And I see that as one of the shortcomings of our policies and legislations today in education. But I'm going to throw it back to Shelley. I think she has another question or comment. Shelley, let me know if you can't unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Thanks for allowing me another question.
Of course.
Actually, just a brief comment in response to, just to add to what JF was speaking about when it comes to, and that question about informing people of their rights. I worked in child welfare for a period of time, and people do have rights about whether or not they choose to engage with child welfare, whether or not to, and whether or not they can, what their steps are that they can take when they're involved in the system, but they're not always informed. And it really depends on who their worker is. And it also comes back to accountability. If it isn't something that is expected or mandated from the top, it's not gonna happen. So that always occurred based on the individual. So I know that I did that because I believe in people knowing their rights, but that, again, it really does go back to the head and what they're mandating. And just my question was, when it comes to education, from a grassroots level, like considering that I read Shakespeare over 30 years ago when I graduated from high school, and I understand it is still part of the curriculum, if a number of parents, you know, in the upcoming school year said, you know what, I don't want my children learning, reading Shakespeare, or I want them to read something else. If they, would parents have the right to collectively demand that another reading be assigned? It's something that is more relevant, because I mean, we've been waiting for years for the government to update the curriculum. So I'm just wondering if that's something that parents could do. Like I can't, like Shakespeare hasn't really benefited me my life, to be honest. And I don't know if it has for many people, but is that something that could be done?
Well, I think, so Ahmed is a vice principal, and I think he is making a suggestion in the group. I'm going to let Ahmed take a perhaps opportunity to speak on this. He seems to have a suggestion.
Thank you.
Oh, there we go. So yeah, so just to come back to that point, so I'm also a former English teacher at the secondary level. So Shakespeare is not part of the curriculum. Reading is part of the curriculum. So in English, you've got reading, writing, oral communication, and media. You absolutely don't need to have Shakespeare as part of that curriculum. And honestly, one of the best ways to get change is to have parents push for that change, because admin will listen. Admin sometimes will listen to students and they'll think, okay, well, let's push the teachers a little bit. Teachers will say oftentimes, well, you know, the kids are just, they need to read this because it's the rigor and everything like that. But when parents are pushing, admin need to listen. And if the admin are not listening, push the superintendent, push the trustees, because there's no need in 2020 that we still need to be teaching Shakespeare. Again, I taught Shakespeare for some of my career when I was an English teacher, but when the kids were telling me, sir, I don't like this, then I stopped doing it. And so you know, you have to be responsive to students. So absolutely, please push that. as a parent group, because those are the things that were outlined too with the school council from before. You have, that's a place that you can go to as the parent, is to go to the school council and say, I would like you to help me push to get rid of Shakespeare in the classes. Because again, it is not part of the curriculum.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
I think that's an amazing realization, and just in helping us to rethink what is education and what is the education that we know of it right now. I thought Shakespeare would have been something that for whatever reason was mandatory. But I think that's a very good clarification. It isn't something that needs to be taught. In fact, there is, if it's just reading or reading at a specific level that's a requisite, then that provides so much range for other books and more representation in the curriculum or the books that are taught. So thank you for that, Ahmed. I think it's a very good point of clarification for us. And in transitioning to Natalie wanted to provide some comment or question as well. So Natalie, I'm going to unmute you and you can go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for the platform. I want to ask a question. I'm not sure about like legally if this could be done, but I really was reading through the other comments, and I feel like unless there is oversight, then we'll just continue having these conversations. I wanted to know if there is room through legislation to like enforce an EDI piece, at least at the level of regulation, oversight, investigatory boards. That way you could have representation that's mandated at the top level, and I'm sure it would trickle down. I feel like it's easier to hold people accountable within the system, but at the very top, it seems like it's not possible to hold those people accountable if we're underneath the hierarchy. So do you think that could be mandated through legislation, that it would have racial representation, specifically to counteract racism, because that's such a large problem right now? Thank you.
I think that's a great point. And I think I would actually argue that the legislation actually requires a degree of equity, diversity, inclusion at a board level. I can't remember which section 160 something, but it's about promoting student wellness and achievement. And a clause in that piece of the legislation speaks about equity and diversity, I believe. At any rate, my understanding is that the law actually requires school boards to promote this level of diversity. The question is whether or not they're being held accountable to that diversity, or to that diversity to support student achievement. And to your point, it becomes very difficult to enforce that if people within the system aren't holding each other accountable. I agree. I don't know what the solution is right now. I believe that the government can perhaps put more laws or policies in place to make it a little bit more effective. But JF has a comment to make as well. Please contribute to that conversation, JF, whenever you're ready.
There we go. All right, cool. So yeah, that's a great question about EDI and its mandate, because it's true, in the Education Act, there's lots of these little weird statements about what the education system is trying to achieve, what the education system is supposed to be for. And part of that is, being sort of being part of the community, which implies reflecting the community. The problem is those particular provisions, while they're in the legislation, you're right, there's no one whose job it is to enforce that. It's sort of sorry to use a big word, it's a hortatory principle. It's like saying you should be doing this, right? With nobody to enforce it. And if I can give an example from my work, well, I guess it's still technically my work, there's another provision in the Act about a principal for the health and safety of pupils, can refuse to admit any person to the school, subject to an appeal. So it said subject to an appeal. Okay, that's an oversight mechanism, right? Like you're able to say, I think this is wrong. Somebody else tell me if this is wrong or right. Great. Nobody had those. It's in the law. And until maybe around 2015, 2016, nobody had those because there was no oversight before then. now I'm going to talk about my work at the Ombudsman's office. We are oversight in a very, very small way. And that's where that particular change came from. But with EDI, for example, yeah, it's something that I think you'd have to argue on multiple fronts, but there's nothing stopping legislation from saying your school board trustees, your school board personnel must reflect the community in which they are located, right? Or the community in which they serve. That's a huge question of political will, though. And that's where organizing, we come back full circle to organizing, right? Because getting that kind of thing enshrined, it exists through the Human Rights Code, sort of, if you can find a ground for it. But it's doable, but it's doable through community organizing and really changing how legislators legislate, quite frankly, or what they legislate. So sorry, that's a really long answer to a really, really great short question.
No, very good question. And it's a question I think the current government has to be able to answer. And we need to keep asking questions about accountability and demand that accountability measures are made in the Education Act or throughout school boards somehow through PPMs or through legislation, whatever the case is. We really think it's significant. All right, I'll allow one more opportunity for anyone to let me know if they have any questions or comments. We are nearing the hour-and-a-half mark. It's been a great conversation so far. Very much enjoying everyone's questions and comments. Let me know if there's anything else in the next few seconds.
The only thing I would add to that question, Natalie, would be it's important to see the difference of what's in theory and then what's actually happening in practice. So we see a lot of recent changes with this government where they want to combat anti-racism and they want to address racism, which is great. That at least saying something about it is a start. It's not even close to being enough because it needs to be meaningfully addressed. So I would just be very cautious of things that I would consider are deceptive, because anyone can say that they're willing to make change, but what is actually happening in practice? So I think it's important for us to watch these legislative changes, but also see how it happens in practice so we can say, hey, actually government or school board or whatever, trustee, specific teacher, whatever the situation is, you are not following ABC. And of course, there are rights under the Human Rights Code of Ontario. There are protected code violations that cannot happen, whether it's race or sexual orientation. We see these happening every day. So again, what's happening in theory is very important to see what's actually in practice. So that's a great question.
All right. So thank you for everyone for joining our conversation today. I'm going to have a few more conversations on behalf of Empowerment Squared and the Hamilton Education Law Program. On August 3rd, I'm actually inviting some youth advocates from across Ontario, from the Hamilton School Board, the Peel School Board, the York or Durham School Board. And these have been young people who have been advocating against some of the systemic issues in their respective school systems. On August 3rd, a couple of days before the webinar, there's going to be a huge rally or protest at Queen's Park in, is it Queen's Park? Downtown Toronto, outside the building. I can't remember which building that they are intending to meet at, but there's going to be a huge rally in support of students across Ontario and the education system. So some of those representatives will have been there. I am very excited to give these youth a platform to share with us some of the issues that they're seeing and experiencing, but also what are some of the solutions that they think. So that's going to be on August 5th. We're going to do that on at 5 o'clock as well. It's going to be a great conversation. I appreciate everyone taking the time this evening to join myself, Patricia, and Hargan, and just engage in a conversation about rethinking Ontario's education system. So thank you so much again. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to any one of us, and we hopefully are able to stay in touch and keep the conversation going, because Ontario's education system is big. And it's a great place to have a conversation and discuss. So have a good night, everyone, and we will hopefully connect again soon.
Thank you, everyone.